Hello everyone, this is Graham Bryan. I'm the president of the Society of Liberty, and today I'll be addressing the topic of universal healthcare. There has been quite a bit of support for implementation of a single-payer system, but there has also been a fair amount of dispute as to whether the system will work. Based on the research I've done, I've concluded that it would simply not be feasible to implement such a plan in the United States. So, without further ado, this is Universal Healthcare Debunked. To understand universal healthcare, we are going to look at some of the common arguments for the system. So what makes a successful case for universal healthcare? Individuals in favor of the system tend to attempt to 1. Prove that healthcare is a human right. 2. Prove that the state provides better healthcare than that of the private sector. 3. Prove that insurance companies would not act in the interest of consumers. 4. Prove that universal healthcare would provide an economic benefit. And 5. Provide substantial evidence to prove that it would work in the US. To understand whether healthcare is a right, we need to look at positive rights in relation to negative rights. Negative rights exist to protect individual liberties. These are the sort of rights that you find in the Bill of Rights. In the context of healthcare, the situation of negative rights generally involves two parties, the individual who needs treatment and the individual who administers the treatment. In this scenario, the individual who is seeking treatment requests that he be treated in exchange for monetary compensation. The doctor, in the interest of making profit, will accept this offer and treat the patient. Private insurance may cover a portion of the treatment, but this is largely a voluntary transaction between two parties in which both benefit. Your negative right to healthcare means that you will not be barred from seeking healthcare. You have a right to access treatment, and no one is justified in preventing you from doing so. Now let's look at positive rights. Positive rights exist to oblige one individual to provide something to another individual. The issue with this is that a positive right to something will ultimately encroach on another party's negative rights. In the context of healthcare, the situation of positive rights again involves two parties. The difference in this case is that the individual seeking treatment is justified in demanding treatment from a care provider. Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines a slave as 1. A person held in servitude as the chattel of another, or 2. One that is completely subservient to a dominating influence. This seems to fit the definition of a care provider under the influence of the positive rights of another individual. Positive rights do not protect the liberties of all individuals. They only seek to justify the coercion of others. The distinction between negative and positive rights is not exclusive to healthcare. For example, you have a right to own a gun. No one is obligated to sell you one. You have a right to free speech. No one is obligated to listen to you. You have a right to knowledge. No one is obligated to teach you. The same idea of slavery applies in all of these situations as well. Put simply, positive rights are unethical and unjustified and cannot exist with negative rights. Based off of this, we can determine that healthcare is not a right. Now to address the second point. Does the state provide better healthcare? Perhaps the best examination of whether the state can satisfy consumer demand is through a supply and demand curve, in which the price, P, is the price of treatment and the quantity, Q, is the amount of treatments. In a free market system, an equilibrium price is reached based on consumer demand and the supply of treatments. However, when everyone is given unlimited access to treatment, there is an obvious incentive for individuals to seek treatment on a more frequent basis, as it is provided at no additional cost to them. This will shift the demand curve upwards, but will have no bearing on the supply curve. This has the effect of raising the equilibrium price. To combat the rise in prices, the government must place a price ceiling on the cost of treatment in order to prevent an extreme burden to the federal budget. This ceiling has the effect of lowering the price, but has the adverse effects of increasing the quantity demanded and lowering the quantity supplied. Consumers will want more of the readily available healthcare, but providers will not supply as much of the care. Because of this, an equilibrium point cannot be reached, and demand will always be greater than the quantity available. This leads to rationing. We have seen rationing implemented before in the Second World War, in which individuals were given ration books to purchase goods in an effort to keep prices low. While it may have served some purpose during this time, there is no reason for rationing to occur now. In the case of healthcare, this leads to individuals being discouraged from seeking care and extremely long wait times. This is all hypothetical, however. Is there any evidence to support this? Well, yes, plenty of it. In 2014, the average wait time for a hospital bed in Canada was 8.8 hours. In 2017, the median waiting time between referral and treatment in Canada was 21.2 weeks. According to a report by Professor Brian Jarman, NHS patients are 45% more likely to die in hospitals than patients in the US. In 2016, over 473,000 patients waited more than 4 hours for an NHS bed. Between 2008 and 2012, 8,000 doctors left Britain to take on a wider field of work. In 2013, it was reported that 37% of NHS workers would not recommend their workplace to friends or family. These issues of rationing and overall dissatisfaction with the system can largely be attributed to the inherent pricing issues that arise in a single-payer system. The situation is no better in a hybrid system such as the Affordable Care Act, under which 6 million have lost their health care and 40% receive no aid from the system whatsoever. While the system may increase the net coverage per individual without having an adverse effect on the quality of care, many of the more affordable private options have vanished. In addition to this, private practices are closing their doors left and right due to their inability to keep up with increasing regulations. As a result, the cost for a hospital stay and the salaries paid there have increased. Despite the fact that the quality of care may be lesser, does a single-payer system have any positive effect on drug prices? The claims made against a privatized system due to the exorbitant drug prices are dubious at best. The United States drug market is heavily regulated by the FDA. As a result, it is not an accurate critique of free market healthcare to compare UHC countries to the US. Many attempt to make this comparison by stating that Canadian drug prices are much lower than in the US. While this is true for name brand drugs, generics are only slightly less than their US counterparts. But, as mentioned before, this is not evidence of a single-payer system working better than a free market economy. Yet again, we see evidence of price controls. The UK, France, and Germany are all examples of countries that have implemented drug price controls. While the price ceiling has not been proven to cause a significant reduction in the quality of drugs, what has decreased is the amount of innovation from each country. We have seen a significant decline in the amount of patents originating from many European countries, whose drug price controls have seen several reforms over the years. Drug manufacturers have less incentive to develop new drugs when their profit margins are smaller. This is not a defense of the massive prices of drugs in the US, however. There is still much room for improvement in the context of the US drug market. The biggest threat to the pocketbooks of the American people is the FDA. The FDA has the capacity to grant monopoly powers to certain entities within the market by granting patents. After monopoly privilege is granted, the recipient has a capacity to charge whatever price they deem appropriate. In addition to this, programs such as Medicare and Medicaid allow for an overall increase in the price of drugs, because while the majority of the US population does not have the capacity to pay for exorbitant drug prices, the government has a larger pool of funds that can be drawn from. Without this financing, these companies would not be able to hike drug prices, as the profit margin would be little to non-existent. In addition to this, the entities can extend their monopoly even further by simply paying a generic company to delay the release of the generic, appropriately called pay for delay. They can also submit a citizen petition, forcing the FDA to review this petition before the drug can be released. Of the total amount of citizen petitions submitted, 92% of these were submitted by branded drug manufacturers rather than individuals. These are often submitted close to the patent expiration date, essentially prolonging the monopoly for another 150 days. In a free market, with unlimited competition, drug companies would simply not be able to pay off every one of their competitors, while still maintaining a sustainable profit margin. Instead, they would be another competitor in the market without any of the government policies to give them an edge. While the initial release of the drug would create a natural monopoly, this would not last for any long period of time. Drug prices would be brought down based on competitive business practices and the law of supply and demand. This leads to the next point. Will the insurance companies act in the interest of consumers? As stated before, without government intervention, companies must provide the best product at the most affordable price point to attract consumers. As consumers are the only source of income for these companies, they ultimately must please the customer if they want to make a profit. They do not do this by colluding and deliberately trying to squeeze the consumer. On the off chance they do, however, a free market with little barrier to entry makes quick work of companies who engage in aggressive price hikes. Lower price competitors are able to steal the monopoly away from said company, and the company is driven out of business. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we can expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. Adam Smith explains perfectly why the greed of insurance companies ultimately provides a better product to consumers. But what about individuals who cannot afford healthcare? What will happen to them? Like I have stated several times, economics is based on supply and demand. If there is a demand for healthcare from low-income individuals, the marketplace will satisfy this demand. The best examples of this are the now defunct benefit societies. A benefit society is a fraternal lodge, or a collection of individuals who approach a care provider, argue for lower prices, and are assigned a rate that is prepaid to the care provider. Historically, the yearly payment to the care provider was around 1 day's wage. Once this amount was paid, individuals involved in the society could receive treatment at any time. Despite this, members encouraged one another not to abuse the system to prevent an increase in premium rates. While this system provided great benefits to those with lower incomes, many of the doctors involved in the system were educated but not necessarily licensed. Because of this, some doctors pandered to the government, insisting that these individuals not be allowed to practice medicine. As a result, the AMA was introduced and was granted monopoly powers over medical licenses in the US. So began the decline of benefit societies. While the welfare state does undoubtedly fail in certain aspects in aiding the poor, would a universal system provide any more economic benefits? The short answer, no. The state has no capacity to generate wealth. The only way the state can obtain wealth is by stealing from its people. Care for people, payment for resources, and compensation for employees can only be achieved through stealing from other individuals. So, what's wrong with this? Countries currently operating under a universal healthcare system have a far less progressive tax rate than the US, meaning that individuals pay more across the board. The socialist-leaning candidates of today would have you believe that taxes will only increase on the top 1% of income earners. For example, Bernie Sanders, whose Medicare for All plan could end up increasing the federal spending over $32 trillion over a 10-year period. It is worth noting that federal spending has consistently exceeded the amount taken in by taxes since around 1961. Implementing this type of spending would drastically increase the already sizable US deficit, while simultaneously not stimulating job growth among low-skilled workers. Medicare for All would only increase the demand for highly skilled workers who are already compensated well. Deficit spending to finance universal healthcare in the US is simply not plausible and would only cause rapid inflation. If the Federal Reserve tried to counteract this rise in inflation by increasing interest rates, trade deficit would rise due to a decrease in private investments. The only feasible way to finance the system is through taxation. As I mentioned before, candidates in favor of the system would have you believe that the taxes will only be substantial for the rich. However, if you examine Sanders' options for funding, implementing his progressive tax rate would generate only 5.5% of the funds needed to finance the plan. If he were able to implement every option he proposes simultaneously, it would only cover half. To fund the system, the US tax structure would have to mirror other countries with similar systems, under which tax rates for all income brackets are raised. Again, this option punishes low to middle class individuals while exclusively stimulating high-skilled jobs. The system will largely have a more negative effect on the economy than a positive one. Which leads to the final point. With this in consideration, there is little evidence to support the claim that a single-payer system would provide a benefit to the US. There is more evidence to suggest that a single-payer system would pose a burden to the economy while decreasing the quality of the American healthcare system. However, there is undoubtedly a need for healthcare reform in the US. If not universal healthcare, what can be done? As stated before, a free market system tends to satisfy the needs of consumers at all levels of income. Privatizing healthcare will promote choice in the market and guarantee that wealth will be generated outside of the healthcare system alone. Removing government mandates, and with more freedom to choose, individuals can select a healthcare plan that they feel covers their needs without the extraneous packages of coverage that follow the ACA. Removing regulations will also allow small private clinics to become competitive again, providing jobs in the local economy rather than just in hospital scenarios. Removing monopoly power from the AMA and decreasing the amount of welfare reliance would also allow for the resurgence of benefit societies to address the needs of the poor. Removing monopoly power from the FDA would ensure competitive drug prices and business tactics that seek to please customers rather than gouge them. Allowing the market to provide healthcare solutions to individuals of all incomes will not ensure universality, as individuals can still elect to not have coverage. However, it will not mandate that anyone be covered, and will still provide a variety of healthcare solutions to all income levels. This has been my video on universal healthcare. If you have your own thoughts on the matter, I would love to hear them, and may even address them in a future video. Thanks for watching and supporting the Society of Liberty. Be sure to leave a like if you enjoyed, subscribe for more videos, and follow us on Instagram and Twitter.